Good morning. Welcome to the Stimson Center and a very exciting morning where we will talk about the newly released budget. The budget was just released yesterday, and we are delighted that we are able to hold an event very well timed to discuss the ins and outs of this budget, what are the implications for various agencies and for the country's security and foreign policy objectives. My name is Rachel Stohl. I'm the director of the Conventional Defense Project program here at Stimson, and I'm really excited this morning because, as you can see, we have an all-women panel to talk about national security issues. So it is possible to find talented women in Washington to talk about these issues. So I'm really excited that you're all here to join us. I want to thank our donors and supporters, particularly the Cologne Foundation, for their support of this project and this event. And I look forward to a really exciting program and discussion this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Kate Brannen, our moderator, who will introduce the rest of the panel and get us started on a really exciting conversation. So thank you and good morning.
Hi, my name's Kate Brannen. I used to live in Washington, but I've actually had to import a woman from New York City to come. But I know that there are other women in D.C. who could talk about national security as well. But I'm currently the deputy managing editor at Just Security, and I'm really excited to be here and be on this panel to talk budget ins and outs. To introduce, I'll start at the far end. This is Laicie Heeley, and she's going to talk about defense issues today. And next, after her is Aditi Gorur, and you're going to talk mostly about the multilateral approach or lack thereof. And then next is Sally Yozell, who's going to talk about the NOAA budget and the state budget and et cetera, et cetera. So we've got all our bases covered. And I thought I would start out with some big picture questions, and then we can drill down into your focus areas a little bit more after that. But first question, all budgets rely on a certain set of assumptions, and this one does, obviously. So I wanted just a question to the whole panel and answer whoever wants to. What are some of the assumptions that underlie this budget, from the economic ones that have gotten a lot of attention in the first 24 hours to the geopolitical ones?
So I'll start since we started with me and introductions. Thanks, Kate. This, Mulvaney said it himself, this is a hard power budget. This is not a budget that is funding any of these lovely ladies' issues. This is a budget that puts a lot of money toward the military. It's a very significant increase, though, of course, a lot of the reports have actually been that we're a bit surprised that this is not a larger increase, because what Trump talked about on the campaign trail and what he really, has really what's come out of the administration, other than, OMB, is a call for significantly more military power, $300 each of Navy and significant bumps in personnel. And we haven't really seen that in this budget. So that's a bit surprising. But it is important still to remember that this is a very, very large military budget. It's top 5 in the post 9/11 era. It's about the same as the peak Reagan buildup when you adjust for inflation. So this is a lot of money going toward the military. This is a lot of money being taken from elsewhere. And ultimately, it's also a fiscally conservative budget. And that's where you see Mulvaney's influence really coming in. Because they're assuming then that they can balance all of that military spending with equal cuts to everything else. And that ultimately, and we will get into this, but is a bit of a fantasy.
Okay. So, can you hear me? Is this good? Did I hit the button is what I'm trying to, okay. All right, so basically, so what I found so interesting about this budget was that, they claim that it drives the economic growth and place American interests first, and that it promotes national security. But from my view, it's really a budget that's about insecurity. I mean, it's short-sighted, and you can see this across the board, whether it's research or environmental programs or many of the other assistance programs. I mean, they're all cut. I mean, as Laicie pointed out, I mean, we really have a significant increase in the defense budget. So not as much as you pointed out, we would have imagined. But, really the hard power, that is really increased. But what I see is instead of the carrot and the stick, it's really a budget about the stick. And if you're going to have global security around the world, you need both. You need the carrot and the stick. And so, I mean, I think the result of, having just the hard power is going to prevent us from having our eyes and ears on the ground, our diplomatic efforts around the globe. And when we find that, we're going to be, no longer being able to understand how do we become, when an incident occurs, how are we going to be resilient, so to speak, whether it's an environmental or natural disaster, or whether it's some unforeseen other kind of disaster. We need to be on the ground. We need to be the eyes and ears. We need to be back and forth with our partners, our global partners around the world. Otherwise, it's just one big stick and the rest is off. And what worries me most about that is it'll create a vacuum. And when we create a vacuum, who's going to move in? Who's going to move in economically? Who's going to move in intellectually? Who's going to move in militarily?
Okay. Do you want to speak to assumptions as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when I looked at this budget, what I saw was two big assumptions. The first being basically that America first means America alone. This is a budget that doesn't show any appreciation for the importance of a multilateral approach to international security. It's a budget that fails to understand that working in a multilateral way, so through institutions like the UN, can often mean that you're relying on the comparative advantages and the strengths of a much broader set of players. So, if you look at an organization like the UN, on a lot of issues, the UN is able to make a much bigger impact than the US could acting alone, and it's also able to get the job done a lot cheaper than the US can acting on its own. And this is not a budget that shows any sort of appreciation for that fact. And I think it's interesting. During the campaign, I think there were a lot of people who thought that the Trump administration would be fairly isolationist, would stay out of international adventures. And over the last few months, we've seen that has not been the case. This is an administration that really wants to have it both ways. It wants to be actively involved in Syria and in North Korea and in Afghanistan. It wants to be involved in global counterterrorism. But at the same time, it doesn't want to put in the investment, the financial investment, into making sure that those actions are smart and effective. So, I mean, I think it's there's a potential for really serious missteps here by the U.S. And I was pleased to see that the budget, there was a strong pushback from both Republicans and Democrats immediately. The second assumption that I see from this budget is sort of more on the economic front, but it's there's an assumption that if the U.S. doesn't pay its dues to international organizations, that other countries will step up and pay instead. And I think that's a very misguided assumption. If you look at the breakdown of what the U.S. Is intending to do, or what the administration's priorities seem to be in this budget, this administration seems to be willing not only to heavily reduce voluntary contributions, for example, to UN agencies like UNICEF or the UN Refugee Agency, but also to simply fail to pay the dues that are assessed for all members of the UN. So, this is simply the U.S. saying, we are comfortable abdicating our responsibility as a member of this international organization. And it goes far beyond the UN. I mean, so the CIO account, the Contributions to International Organizations account in this budget would be cut by 27%. And that is an organization that pays not only the UN regular dues, but also dues to 40 other international organizations. So that includes NATO, it includes the IAEA, it includes the World Health Organization. So for the US to say, we are comfortable failing to pay what we owe, I think there's very little reason to believe that that'll encourage other countries to step up. On the contrary, I think it'll encourage a downward spiral where you'll see other countries saying, well, if the US isn't willing to pay, then why should we?
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about assumptions, and we mentioned a little bit about the reaction it's received, and we'll get to that more a little later. But all presidents' budgets are a proposal, they're a blueprint, but of course Congress holds the power of the purse, and they're the ones that are actually going to appropriate the money. So in many ways, the Trump budget as presented is not what we're going to see enacted. But it does express the priorities of the White House, and we've talked a little bit about them, hard power and other things. But if we could, in sort of each your focus areas, go into a little bit more, what does this say about what the Trump administration's priorities are, and was there anything in there that surprised us? Which I think the answer might be, spoiler alert, no, but go ahead.
Actually, from a defense perspective, I think one of the most surprising things was how little there was that was surprising. This budget looked surprisingly similar to Obama-era proposals. And I really think that that is a testament to just how much the Obama administration was spending on defense. There are a lot of folks who would say otherwise. But when you really, clearly the Trump administration has given a lot of leeway to folks like Mattis and to the services to really request what it is that they need, and this is a budget that represents what they need. So, there's a little bit of a disconnect there between some of the rhetoric saying that we've got a hollow force, or we've, really readiness has faltered in recent years, versus, what the services are actually saying that they need and what we're seeing in this budget. And, we see sort of a lot of the same sort of Obama-era stuff happening, although I would say maybe on a higher level, particularly when it comes to overseas contingency operations. Particularly the 17 supplemental, I think, really gave a little bit of a green light to the Pentagon to start playing with OCO a little bit more, throwing a little bit more. We're seeing some things like modernization of certain programs starting to creep into that funding, and that's a really interesting shift, because there was a time not so long ago when Congress and the Pentagon were really, there was some money shifting back and forth between base and OCO war funding, but it was very hidden, and they were much more secretive about any of those types of shifts, and there was a lot more scrutiny in terms of what really could stand up as a potential shift from base to OCO. That scrutiny is really breaking down.
Yeah, it's a return almost to the Bush administration, when OCO was kind of a free-for-all.
Yeah, absolutely.
F-35s and everything else. Okay, to the next sort of set of priorities.
Sure. I mean, I think it's been very hard to determine priorities with this administration. Yesterday, the State Department released its fact sheet that outlined the priorities that it said underlay its budget request. Mm-hmm. It's very hard for me, looking at that set of stated priorities, to see how you could come up with a budget like this based on those priorities. It seems to me that the Trump budget really undermines a lot of its stated priorities. So if you look at an issue like refugees and migration, that came up very strongly in the campaign. It's been a strong message since then. The U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, has been very vocal about asserting how much of a priority refugee assistance globally is. And yet, when you look at the budget, there's about an 18% cut to refugees and migration issues, and 100% cut to emergency assistance on refugees. And that's really astounding for an administration that claims that it's such a priority. And what that does is, you think about the immediate impact. Okay, this is going to have an extremely severe impact on areas like Syria, for refugees in immediate need of assistance. But the impact goes a lot further than that as well. So it's not just the refugees who are in need of immediate assistance that are impacted, but when you think about, say, neighboring countries that are hosting, neighboring countries around Syria that are hosting refugees right now, they are absorbing a lot of the economic brunt of taking in some of those refugees. And without assistance to agencies like UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, that are trying to fill that funding gap, they're trying to provide those neighboring countries with some assistance to take in those refugees, you're going to see a lot of potential effects it could have a destabilizing effect on local communities that are hosting refugees in neighboring countries, so increasing tensions there. It could have a destabilizing economic effect on some of these neighboring countries that are partners of the U.S., that the U.S. wants to be strong politically. And if the situation gets really bad, you're going to see more migration of Syrian refugees and other refugees from that area to Europe, which the Trump administration says it doesn't want. So I think, the refugee issue is just one of several. If you look at that State Department fact sheet, it talks about global counterterrorism, the fight against ISIS and other terrorist organizations. It talks about global trafficking and combating transnational crime. All of those, and I'm happy to go into more details later, but all of those are really, those stated priorities are really undermined by the actual figures that we see coming out of that budget.
There's also the sort of a visual of the cognitive dissonance. I would think it was yesterday that Heeley was visiting with refugees on the same day this budget comes out, and she's sort of promoting the cause and saying these cuts, will somehow make it work, which just is incredible.
Right, no, absolutely.
Sally?
So, one of the things, I'm glad that you got an Obama-like budget in the Defense Department. I would say that's probably the only part of the whole government that could say that, because this certainly couldn't be more different from what the priorities are as the budget reflects. But I would agree it is sort of a schizophrenic budget in that, it says one thing, but yet actually the budget itself portrays something else. One thing that for me I found particularly astounding was the lack of intellectual focus on some of the really important programs. Like, for example, it looked like just across the board, whether it was domestic or international, if a program had the word ocean or environment or climate or research or science, it was just summarily cut. And it didn't seem like it was targeted or focused at all on the specifics of what any of those budgets, what any of those programs might do or how they may be helpful, as I said, either domestically or internationally. But with that said, focusing on the State Department budget, for example, the State Department budget has about a 30% cut for both the State Department and USAID. And I think that sends a really strong message about what we think about, development assistance around the world. But what I found particularly interesting in the State Department budget is very few programs were left unharmed. There were a few, intelligence, which is really important, but on the other hand, the regional bureaus all across the world were cut as well. And these were some of the regions that, that we have some of the most volatile and dangerous issues going on. So it didn't matter if it was, South Central Asia or Africa or Europe or East Asia Pacific, all of them face cuts. And so, again, for folks who may or may not be familiar with what those bureaus do, they do promote and advance peace and security. They do strengthen democratic institutions. They protect human rights. They spur economic growth. They do trade and investment and health. And they, in my view, they really advance diplomatic effectiveness around the world, which then helps support and collect intelligence and, that counterterrorism. So when you see the top line message coming out of the Trump administration's budget, and then you peel back the onion, so to speak, what you see is pretty disappointing if those are truly your goals. I loved it. Secretary Mattis, I think it was, a while ago, said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need to buy more ammunition. Or as I like to riff, State Department, you have to fund State Department more, or we're going to war. And I think so. Those are sort of those broad sort of international regional programs. But looking at the program that's called OES, Oceans, Environment, and Science. That's a program that deals with issues like climate, like Arctic, fisheries treaties, science, health. With Zika and Ebola, they were very engaged in that last year. So the OES budget has been slashed 94%. Basically, they have left a small cadre of people in Washington who can get on a Skype call or whatever to participate in conferences. But around the world, the programs have really been basically eliminated in this budget. And then, food security. The food security program, a 70% cut. So a lot of these programs that are critically important are just zeroed out. And what happens when you zero out these kinds of programs? I mean, one of the things I think about from my own experience when I was at State Department was sometimes environmental diplomacy is an easy way to have a conversation with countries that you have to have tougher conversations on other issues. And it's a nice way to start to develop relationships and get in. So this completely undermines that. But it also undermines the fact that, if you're a developing country that is sort of on the margins economically or lacking in governance or has no governance, if you have any kind of major environmental catastrophe, whether natural or as a result of like overfishing or whatever, you're going to be in serious, the lack of governance when these things flip, you could easily see, terrorists or transnational organized crime or whatever coming in to fill a vacuum. And we've seen that in Somalia, where, for example, recently, where piracy had ended more or less, and then suddenly overfishing has occurred there. We have distant water Chinese fishing fleets and other governmental fishing fleets coming in, ruining the Somali infrastructure, ruining their fishing grounds, and suddenly we have an uptick in piracy, and all of those pirates are fishermen. Mm-hmm. That, coupled with a drought there, where food security, is an issue, has really, made that a problem. And you can talk about other areas around the world. South Sudan, also a problem. Look at, if say Sri Lanka or, Bangladesh, for example, if there's a major flood or drought, and people rush to the city, no jobs, no place to live, all of those sorts of issues are going to, again, who's going to fill that vacuum? Is it going to be some of the, organized crime, or is it going to be terrorism organizations? Who's going to step in? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think our goodwill around the world really helps sort of prevent those sort of things from taking place, or helps minimize them. We won't have to play catch up once an incident occurs. We'll already be on the ground. We'll already have been part of building the resilience for those types of nations. I mean, I could go on and on. I'll stop, but I'm sure I'll have more to say later.
Well, I keep having lots of big picture questions, so I haven't yet gotten to my specific ones, but I'm going to stick to the big picture. One thing that strikes me as we talk about it, sort of the schizophrenia of the budget, or the fact that it's taking issues and divorcing them from everything else, like to not connect the fact that if you have these enormous refugee camps and you're not providing assistance to refugees, that's a breeding ground for terrorism. Or if you're not helping with famine relief, that is an opportunity for terrorist groups. And if terrorism, which is obviously a big Trump priority, counterterrorism, taking a more holistic approach seems to be the conventional wisdom of what works. So to get at this question, I was curious if some of this schizophrenia or sort of cognitive dissonance that you're seeing stems from sort of the decentralization or the chaos that we read about at the White House. Do you think that OMB, National Security Council, and whether it's state or DOD are talking or worked closely enough in creating this budget? What's your sense of that?
My sense is that people aren't in place to have a really strategic budget. I mean, just from a Defense Department perspective, you don't have a Deputy Secretary of Defense, you have an acting Deputy Secretary of Defense, you don't have a comptroller in place. You need those people to create a really strategic budget. It's not clear to me that state and defense are talking, or that defense even would approve of this type of budget. It's not clear to me that that this is really coming from a strategic place at all, frankly. Mm-hmm. My sense is that that the president has largely promised a very big defense increase. But he's chosen an OMB director who is traditionally very fiscally conservative, and would not be particularly excited even about that big defense increase, right, based on his past positions. But that that Mulvaney's influence really weighs heavily in this budget, in that this very sort of meat axe, chop across the board approach to sort of cutting anything that Trump campaigned even a little bit against, and then this sort of more modest, although large defense increase that maybe is also sort of playing a little bit to those campaign promises, but not going all the way. It looks more like a budget that came out of OMB than it does one that really came from the departments.
I want just to stick with defense, because I know part of it is they have a handful of strategic reviews underway. They have the National Defense Review, they have the Nuclear Posture Review, right. And my sense from yesterday, the briefing at the Pentagon, was we need to wrap those up and kind of figure out what we're thinking, and then stay tuned for FY19. That'll be a doozy. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. So the rhetorical line seems to be, we couldn't get it together this year, so so you just wait, because next year we're gonna have a real build up in there for you, and it's gonna be very big. Now, I would say one thing I would say about that is that anytime Congress, the Defense Department, anytime the government says next year, sometimes it means next year and then next year and then next year, and it never really happens. On the other hand, they do have 3 major strategic reviews going on right now. Those will influence policy, I assume, although if they look anything like past reviews, often the Defense Department has a tendency to want to do it all the time. And so the chance that they'll be really significantly different, I'm not sure. Yeah. And that also has a little bit to do with the fact that the president himself consistently seems to flip-flop back and forth, depending on the last person he talks to. He was anti-NATO, now he's pro-NATO. Now we're throwing more money into the European Reassurance Initiative. It's all a little confusing to try and decide exactly what the strategic perspective of, and I don't think they have one at this point. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, but the Defense Department is saying that anything in the fit-up, anything past 2019, you should just basically throw it out, because it doesn't mean anything right now, because we've got all of these reviews underway, and it'll all change next year. Mm-hmm. So don't put too much analysis into this current budget.
Okay. To shift both to Congress but also away from the Pentagon for a second, what has been the response from Congress over the last 24 hours? But also, we had the skinny budget come out in March, is that right? And then the omnibus passed at the beginning of May, and that was a chance for Congress to, so there's what they say, but then what they did in that budget, I think, reflected some of what they could do with this budget. So could you talk a little bit about where they reversed things and where we will see pushback and where maybe we won't?
So, in the budgets that I follow, which are NOAA, EPA, State Department, others, essentially, it was fascinating to me. In the CR, the continuing resolution, it basically continued the programs as is, with some minor cuts or tweaks around, and it'll be curious to see if that is reflected as they move out. This budget for sure is dead on arrival, and you definitely have heard that from both Republicans and Democrats. They across the board. I don't think I've really heard many, if any, who have said many positive things about it. So I think you'll see a very different budget coming out of the appropriations process. And I think having such, close, having the Democrats, having so many Democrats in the Senate, I think that's going to make a difference when they come to having to negotiate, what the final outcomes will be. So I think on the appropriations, I think the ability for Democrats to hold up things, and this Congress wants to show that it can get things done. I think you'll see a very different budget coming out of it. One thing I just wanted to note, though, from what the previous question you had asked, who was working with whom, or were they aware, or whatever. I mean, honestly, I think Secretary Tillerson is very aware of what he has proposed. He said he had a town hall meeting recently with State Department employees, and he said, we're going to cut 2,000 employees. He's asked them to basically give them recommendations on which programs to cut, how to cut, so they can walk to the guillotine, in their own way. But I guess the thing is so I think he also said, we have values and morals, but our values are going to be very reflective in this budget. And I think he knew exactly what was going on, what he was proposing. So, and similarly, there aren't many staff below him in senior positions. There aren't any undersecretaries. There aren't any assistant secretaries. So there isn't anyone there currently to push back. So we'll see what comes out next year in the budget, and how they operate throughout the next year.
Your comment about Tillerson reminds me of a comment that Steve Bannon made at CPAC. He said the cabinet secretaries have been picked to implement, what's the word he used? Not destruction, but the disassembly, basically, of the administrative state. Now, I don't know that that's true of Secretary Mattis at the Pentagon, but I think you are seeing that in Tillerson for sure. Anything we've kind of covered like 3 questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't,
No. I think, so maybe one issue that ties all of your questions together, I've been particularly following the UN peacekeeping budget. And I think it's interesting on a lot of different counts. So one is when you talk about how strategic was this budget, how much consultation was there. We heard this figure of $1 billion cut to UN peacekeeping starting to float out of the White House a couple of months into the administration, before the skinny budget came out. And then there was this pressure on Nikki Haley to find, to review the different UN peacekeeping operations currently underway to figure out which ones were, worthy of being cut to meet that $1 billion figure. And lo and behold, this budget cuts UN peacekeeping by about $700 million, but when you add it all together with different budget lines, it works out to about $1 billion. So was there any real strategy behind it? Doesn't seem to me like there was any real thinking about why $1 billion, where, how would that affect U.S. priorities? It just was a number, and that number is reflected in this budget. So in terms of how much strategy there was, I think that is illustrative. And then when you look at how much things have changed. So on funding, on foreign assistance funding, there was very little change from the skinny budget to this one, which I think also reflects, that is not where this administration has felt any pressure to change. This is not, domestic issues are always going to be a higher priority or have more immediate visibility. So things like, confronting the administration to say, you promised that combating the opioid crisis in this country was going to be a priority, and this budget doesn't reflect that. We saw a change in that issue. Foreign assistance is never going to have that kind of pull. So there was no significant change between the skinny budget and this one. And then last on your question about Congress, UN peacekeeping is a perennial political football for Congress. I hope and believe that they're not going to get $1 billion cut. But when you look at the FY17 budget, there was a pretty steep cut in peacekeeping there. So based on the FY17 bill, we are looking to be about $250 million in arrears. We'll have a shortfall of about $250 million in our dues to the UN. And then when you add on the potential cuts in FY18, it looks like a very serious picture. I mean, there is no way to accomplish cuts like this without completely eliminating some of the most critical UN peacekeeping missions in the world. I just came back a few days ago from the Central African Republic. That's the newest UN peacekeeping mission. They are operating on about $1 billion a year. The Central African Republic is a country 2.5 times the size of France. And without the UN peacekeepers there, holding it together with chewing gum and twine, that country would not exist as a country. It would be a complete free-for-all. It's also an incredibly natural resource-rich country. There are a lot of trafficking routes going through that country into neighboring countries that include Sudan, Chad. This is a part of the world that you want to have some semblance of governance in. So how does this all match up with U.S. priorities? I don't see a lot of strategy there. And it would mean cutting major peacekeeping missions like the one in Central African Republic. So yeah, I mean, even if we don't see $1 billion cut, even if Congress does stand up, I think there will be cuts coming for UN peacekeeping, and I think it's going to have a very serious effect on U.S. priorities around the world.
Okay. One thing I definitely wanted to hit on before we turn over to the audience questions is this idea that, and you see it in the State Department budget and foreign military financing, the shift from grants, grants to loans across the board. And we talked before we started, excuse me, I forgot to listen to my voice here.
Just an emotional topic.
It really is. That when the U.S. isn't there to provide the money or the support, countries might turn to somewhere else to get the money, in an easier fashion. So talk me through that a little bit, and also who could step in when the U.S. steps back? And it doesn't just have to be in financing, but like you said, if you're Skyping into a phone call, to a meeting, or you're not showing up to whether some multilateral body, who takes advantage of that? How does that play out?
What are you saying, Tom?
I think the obvious answer in many ways is China. I mean, we're already seeing that all around the world today without even us stepping back necessarily. So, I mean, I think that's a huge vacuum area, whether it's militarily, whether it's economically, or whether it's their own kind of development assistance. So, I mean, I think that's, concerning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's plenty of reason to think about China. I mean, when it comes to UN peacekeeping, China was already moving to play a much more prominent role. It's the only Security Council member that is contributing significant troops. So China gave its first combat battalion to UN peacekeeping mission, the one in South Sudan, a few years ago. And that signaled a pretty significant shift for China, a country that had always used, we have to respect national sovereignty as an excuse not to intervene in other countries. I don't think it's any coincidence that South Sudan also has significant oil interests for China. But when you look at the gap that as the U.S. pays less to UN peacekeeping, that will mean that it reduces political influence, and there are going to be countries like China that step in to fill that gap. But on the other hand, there might be areas, so countries that do have political significance, where China might want to play a larger role. That's one thing. There are also going to be plenty of instances where the U.S. doesn't play its role, both financially and politically, and then no one does, right? So there are going to be countries like the Central African Republic or like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where, I mean, you can make an argument for that if say, Central African Republic falls apart, that it will become a terrorist haven. There's plenty of reason to think that's a possibility. But it's not the reality right now. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's just a country that that was experiencing serious interreligious strife, where there almost was a genocide, and a genocide would have taken place had the UN peacekeepers not stepped in. Mm-hmm. Who cares about a country like that? If the U.S. doesn't want to fund UN peacekeeping, do we really think that the rest of the international community is going to step in and fill that financial gap? I think it would be more likely that if the U.S. doesn't step in, it doesn't play its role financially, more countries would see that as an excuse for them not to pay their dues.
This reminds me of something that goes on in the science budget. There's clearly a pullback on funding to research institutes and grants, and I think the idea or the assumption underlying that is the private sector will step in and do that. But there are so many areas that could count that they're the Central African Republic of science that the private sector isn't going to come in, but that are still public health issues or Could you speak to that maybe a little bit?
Well, I think there's no doubt. I mean, that when I talk about short-sighted, I mean, investments in science and research, not just in hard science, but in all sorts of research that we've done just to sort of I can just give one example. So there's been ocean acidification. That's a climate-related issue. I mean, that's something we've been working on over the years very closely with some of the Eastern African countries. I mean, who's going to help on that sort of a research project, and what does that do for them? I mean, what it is they rely on shellfish and seafood, and they're trying to figure out how to address ocean acidification that comes from climate devastating their shellfish, for example. And if we're not there to help them and they lose that, and that's, again, another economic piece that's so important. I mean, science really drives economics, in my opinion. And so it's very short-sighted. And, I noted that, I want to note that 225 business leaders wrote to Secretary Tillerson asking him not to cut the diplomatic and development work that state does and USA does around the world. I mean, these are business leaders. And these are, again, it's for that economic reason. Mm-hmm. And it goes with a scientific reason. And also, if you look at, for example, climate, I mean, us completely taking climate out of every aspect of every budget in the federal government is so short-sighted in our understanding of how to address what's coming forward, whether it be, increased storms or sea level rise or warming and all the rest of that. Plus, looking at how angry we've already heard coming out of folks who signed the Paris Agreement. When we step back from that, we're going to lose a huge economic ability to participate and have businesses in the U.S. that are really coming up and stepping into the role for renewable energy and other sort of issues. So I mean, it is so intertwined.
Mm-hmm. I have a million more questions, but I will only ask one more, I think, before I turn it over to the audience, and then maybe I'll jump in with more. But I wanted to one more to Laicie, I think specifically, but everyone else feel free to chime in. I feel like you can't talk about the defense budget without talking about the Budget Control Act spending caps. Yeah. This just ignores them, right? And what do you see as sort of the way forward?
Yeah, so it's not so unusual for a president's request to ignore the budget caps. Mm-hmm. Obama had gotten into the habit of this as well, really coming in high and then assuming that Congress will kind of work it out. Mm-hmm. And one of the way that Congress has worked it out is by taking a lot of that money and throwing it into OCO.
Which isn't subject to the caps.
Which is separate from the caps.
Yeah.
And separate from the caps for, originally a very good reason. It's war spending. So, you don't want to put a cap on war spending. We need what we need. Unfortunately, particularly in the last few years, the OCO account has, the designation has, it's not been updated since 2010, the guidance around the designation. So it doesn't actually cover most of our current operations right now. It doesn't cover any funding that might go to readiness. It doesn't cover anything in Syria or Libya. It doesn't cover even the European Reassurance Initiative. So it's gotten very loose, the concept of what can go in and out of that designation and what can land there. And in 2017, we see that the Trump administration essentially requested a lot more money, and they requested it as base funding, and Congress took that request, and they picked it up, and they plopped it down just as it was, a big chunk of it into OCO. And so it's gotten very loose at this point. It's to a place where we're really just putting a lot of base funding in there. The Pentagon says that it's around half of the designation, which is $30 to $40 billion at this point, is going to fund enduring base budget needs. And so what's really interesting is this budget is about $52 billion over the caps. So we're playing with about $52 billion that ultimately the top line stays the same, but it's $52 billion that could end up making the OCO designation balloon to over $100 billion if you throw it all in there. So, and that's taking us back to the height of the wars. So we really can't ignore at this point that this is no longer a war spending account. And the biggest problem with that is that we're still living under the BCA caps. We're still pretending that we have some sense of fiscal responsibility, that we're keeping parity between defense and domestic spending, and in reality, we're just taking all the extra money and we're throwing it in this other account, and then we're pretending that we're keeping parity or we're keeping fiscal responsibility, that we're keeping the debt or the deficit down. We're doing none of that at this point. We're just spending.
So the OCO will be an escape hatch, but will it cover the full increase? Unlikely politically to go through.
Unlikely to cover the full increase. Yeah. So what we've seen in past years is, and what we're likely to see again, now this is assuming that Congress does actually get around to a budget deal and passing a full budget, which, I mean, we came down to the wire this year. CRs are getting more and more common. The possibility of a full year CR this year is more likely than ever, I think. Now, obviously, Congress is going to want to avoid that. But what we've seen in the past is some sort of budget deal that raises the cap slightly, and then some of the excess is put into OCO so that we get ultimately a slightly lower number somewhere. I don't want to put a number on it because we'll see what Congress comes up with, but somewhere lower than the actual 52, something that Congress is a little more comfortable with. And I think that politically is all that's feasible, because Democrats are also going to require a domestic boost along with that. They're not going to allow a big cap increase in a budget deal for defense unless there's an equal one for domestic. So it'll all work out somewhere in the middle would be my guess.
Okay, before I turn it over, anything you want to that we didn't cover that you want to flag, be sure to flag. And we didn't, there's so much to talk about, from nukes, vets, development assistance. Go for it.
So let me just say, I didn't even touch on, for example, NOAA's budget, which I'm pretty well steeped in. What that budget showed that was proposed was interesting. It was, the biggest cuts were in programs for states or for research. And, they talk about wanting to send activities back to the states to do, yet they completely cut the Coastal Zone Management Program. By $70 million. It's, one of the biggest programs they have.
Tsunami warning, tornado warning systems. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. So these are on the ground in-state and community programs that were the National Estuarine Research Reserve Program, completely eliminated. And so I think you could magnify that across many of the domestic programs. So we're talking about the development programs. The development and community programs in the domestic budget are also really slashed. So
which is important to remember, because I could imagine to a Trump sympathetic audience that say, well, you know what, it's America first. We don't care about Bangladesh. But the domestic version of whatever that program is here in the United States also cut.
Exactly. And, we have a former economist from NOAA here, but I think the number is 30, what is it, the jobs number for NOAA, that the investment of jobs in NOAA is 30%. Yeah. What is the generation of jobs from NOAA programs?
So 3 million is immediately on the ocean, but you can get up to 30 million. Its numbers were better at 300 billion for weather, 30 million for corals and water.
So it's the magnifying, it's investment in this gets you that in jobs around the United States, and so it's such a cut in our own economic investments here at home.
No, yeah, I think we can probably just throw it open to Q&A.
Okay, sorry.
I'll let you do that too. I'm happy to talk more about nukes or any of Congress's handling of this, or McCain's suggestions for a much higher budget. I think there are a lot of things that we could be talking about on the defense side.
Let's let the audience guide us. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming.
I'm Bob Berg, Alliance for Peace Building and the Stimson Center. Just a quick comment that one of the most significant cuts was the development assistance in favor of the Economic Support Fund. What that means is giving up long-term interests and going for short-term political interests. And don't forget, the same personnel office that appointed all these wonderful people in the cabinet is going to appoint all these wonderful ambassadors who may, well, anyway. So let me ask a hypothetical on a hypothetical, which is what we do at think tanks. And what if we're under a continuing resolution, right, which looks like that's what people are, the default position that we're all heading for, and administrators refuse to spend the money and run right into the Budget Empowerment Act. To what extent do you think these cuts are going to be instituted in the fields you follow, even if there is a continuing resolution?
Well, everybody I know is lawyering up. I mean, I think Congress is going to be watching that very closely. You know, it's almost like there's a parallel universe going on, whether it is with the budget caps as we discussed and what Congress is proposing. And if we do go with the CR and these and agencies are supposed to be implementing certain things, I really believe that the appropriators are going to be hauling them up on a regular basis and then just grilling them, because we've seen since day one information is leaking out of these agencies like it's a sieve or a colander. And I think for those that really believe in their programs, that is not going to stop. And there is going to be a direct line, whether it's Dixie Cups or whatever, going right up to the appropriations committees saying we're not spending our funds, we need help. I think Congress is going to be the one to step in and do what they can there.
I did see even in the, I think it was Noah's budget, but even the way it was written was almost like a cry for help. It was like, this program will be cut. It saves lives and protects jobs. Did you know?
Well, the NOAA budget is written just like the NOAA budgets have been written for the last decade, and is the way I read it. And, there's no one there right now. There's no NOAA administrator. I felt like, and I've been witnessing this with NOAA, I think they just took their regular operational, the way they do work on a regular basis, and just continued it. I don't think they had any direction other than from the senior budget office saying we need to achieve these cuts, cut them across the board, and cut them specifically on the programs that are so popular at home that they'll probably be they'll be funded in the end. So in a way, I saw a budget that was like, we need to reach this number. We're going to cut the most popular programs because we know Congress will put them back in. And it was written in a way that has been written in NOAA budgets for years.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe just one other comment on that point. I mean, part of the reason it's difficult to know is that we don't have a lot of details. So we have the top line proposed cuts, right? So, for example, the CIO count contributions to international organizations. We know that they want to cut it by about 27%, but we don't know which of the agencies. Does that mean 27% to each of the 41 different international organizations that fall under that account equally, or does that mean we fully fund NATO, but we completely eliminate funding to the WHO? We don't know yet, and I think the different organizations obviously have different clout and different appreciation in Congress. So UNICEF is a very popular agency for U.S. Congress. So maybe, proposed cuts to UNICEF might generate more pushback than proposed cuts to UNFPA did.
Interesting.
Thanks. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. A couple of comments, and then see if you can figure out where this is going to go. First one is that after the skinny budget came out, Secretary Tillerson pushed back in his reclama and said, not 31%. How about 21% but spread out over 2 years? And he lost that. It was 29% in 1 year. And the solution to the sequester is put it in OCO, but in the budget itself, Mulvaney said, we're going to start a multi-year program to get out of OCO, and we're going to cut it back to the original countries. So that isn't really a solution either. if you remember during the campaign, it's at one point, then candidate Trump, when confronted with the internal consistencies in his budget figures, he wanted to add this and this and this and cut this and this, and it was going to be a debt bomb. He said, well, this is what I want, but they're not going to let me do it. And so my conclusion about this budget, this is like his executive orders. It's not really a budget. It's a political statement of where he is, and he doesn't expect it to go forward. He just wants to be able to say to his base, this is what I stand for. I'm wondering what you think the Congress's reaction is going to be to that.
Well, we saw some of them throwing it in the trash yesterday. So it was, I think that, Congress's reaction on both sides of the aisle has been to say that this budget is, beyond DOA, that it's, particularly on the domestic side, particularly on the State Department, UN, all of these cuts, Congress is not going to take them at face value. I can say that almost without exception. However, when appropriators do look at this, they will take it into my understanding is they will take it into consideration, and some of these things will come down a little bit. And so, how much they come down is going to be a very good question. I will say one thing. I agree with you very much that this is a sort of a dream document. This is in a perfect world, in maybe Mulvaney's perfect world, this is what we would do. I find it very interesting that that defense didn't receive a larger increase in the perfect world situation. It's a very big increase.
Like you said, it's Mulvaney's perfect world.
It's right, exactly. It's Mulvaney's perfect world, right? So that may be the explanation, is that really the Trump perspective here is not having quite as much of an influence as we expected it to. And actually, ultimately, Trump's could have gone either way. It could have been a big buildup, or it could have been a strategy of restraint, which is something that he was. Many people would argue he was elected on, staying out of the world, not getting into other people's business, and stepping back a little bit. Maybe pulling people out of other countries, but that didn't materialize either. So it's very interesting.
I think it's similar to other campaign promises that he's made. They're incoherent. You can't have a giant increase in defense spending and massive deficit reduction. They don't go hand in hand, as well as a huge tax cut.
Yeah. I think your question also goes to the question of why are we bothering to spend so much time looking at this document, right? If we know that it's never going to happen. Yeah. And I think that there is a very good reason, which is this. So even if you put aside for the moment Laicie's very good point that that there will be some influence on how Congress approaches this. So for example, I do think even though that hopefully the UN peacekeeping won't be cut by $1 billion, that Congress will use it as a reason to consider much steeper cuts to peacekeeping than they otherwise would. Even if you put that aside, put Congress's reaction to this document aside. In the last few months, I've been approached by several different government representatives from foreign governments asking me, what is Trump's foreign policy? What can we expect? They had no idea what to expect based on this White House's statements and its actions. They don't match up with each other. So, these were all of the governments that I was speaking to were very close partners of the U.S. One of them told me that he was terrified because he had no way to anticipate what this government would or wouldn't do in the realm of foreign policy. And another used the word afraid. And so this is a document that's not just going to be looked at by Congress, it's also going to be looked at by our partners around the world. And they're going to be trying their best to read the tea leaves and figure out what this government's foreign policy is.
And hedge.
Yes, that's right. And even though the budget that's eventually adopted won't look very much like this proposal, I think we can still discern some kinds of, as Kate, started the conversation with, some kinds of assumptions and priorities about this government's foreign policy approach that foreign governments will be reading very closely.
I just wanted to ask briefly, I know you mentioned the ERI, but as one of the biggest increases in the defense portion of the budget, do you see this as a strategic calculation? Is it political? Does it show a trend, or is it more of kind of a wish list?
So, with specifically to ERI, it actually saw a far bigger increase in the last budget under the Obama administration. It saw a very large bump. Now, the reason I'm so surprised by ERI is because of Trump's early rhetoric on NATO. I really thought that was one to watch because I expected it to go down. It's gotten a pretty big bump, and when you really look at it, some of the bigger bumps are to some of these weapons modifications, things that shouldn't traditionally fall in sort of emergency war funding money, which is what this is. I mean, ERI has always been a little shaky in the OCO designation because it's a deterrence-based mission, right? You're sending a lot of equipment overseas, but you're not really fighting battles. You're deterring Russia. That's what a lot of this money is going to. European reassurance. It's essentially adding a little bit of money to reassure our allies, our European allies, so it's not exactly emergency money. It's something that should be enduring anyway because it may last for quite some time. It's not an active conflict. All of these things, but it's really getting more interesting as time goes on because some of these other things are working their way in, and it's starting to look a little bit more like a procurement account than it is really a legitimate contingency funding account.
I was curious if that's an area where there's some schizophrenia on the Eastern European kind of states between defense and state. Defense is getting a plus up, but is state, when it comes to assistance of other forms to these countries, is it getting cut?
Yeah. It pretty much, as I said, it pretty much got cut across the board, except for the intelligence program. I mean,
so not walking hand in hand there. It's state defense when it comes to.
We're really looking at a budget that
Russian deterrence.
Says all the weapons, military deterrence, but none of the support that defense needs to carry out any of this mission.
I mean, again, I talked about the business folks who wrote Secretary Tillerson. Well, equally, there were like 121 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, who wrote a similar letter saying, please do not cut the development funds. They're really important around the world for us to have both balance, the soft and the hard power, to achieve what we need to in security around the world.
Mm-hmm. I saw, and I don't remember where, somebody joked, going back to the Mattis quote, fund state or get me more ammo, and they got him more ammo.
Exactly.
Before we go to another audience question, I wanted to ask about the Paris Climate Accord and make sure we talk about it. How do these cuts affect the implementation of that, if at all?
Oh, they totally devastated. Okay. The Green Climate Fund is completely eliminated, as well as all the research that a variety of agencies, whether it's NOAA or NASA or NSF, it's all cut. But it doesn't mean we're going to pull out necessarily. We could just stay at the table so we can hear what others have to say and have zero tools to implement anything. DOE as well, and got completely all of their renewable energy and climate programs were cut. And, that may be their way of, I think as you pointed out, we're going to not fund, the money might be there, but we're not going to fund it. It's sort of their way of doing that in a sense. But what we've heard pretty strongly, particularly from our European allies, is that, if you walk away from the table, we're not communicating with you at all on a lot of things. And I think they're going to see more and more of that, is that communications are going to be cut from our traditional allies around the world, not just on environment and climate issues, but on many other issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other?
I guess I have a question speaking to both the increasing prices and awareness of the humanitarian and refugee crisis, as well as global climate change, becoming more and more aware, and how can we, what are the strategic implications, I guess, of looking at the Trump budget as a rhetoric mechanism on how foreign governments can and will react to this, and in turn, how would that affect both like Congress and like the effects of continuing to fund these programs or defund these programs, as the case may be?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but is it about how foreign governments are going to respond to cuts to humanitarian funding?
I think it's probably a two-part question, of which how does the international community react? Like there has been more calls, especially kind of world leaders in the G7 summit, to continue being included within the Paris Climate Agreement, but also like what can we expect in the political realm of how the United States should react and what its role can and will be in the future events?
Well, I mean, on the climate, as I just said, I mean, we really cajoled and worked with a lot of world leaders to bring all countries along to sign the Paris Agreement. And I think people who were part of that process around the world feel that we are just dropping the ball on something that is so important. And I think, when you think about, a couple inches of sea level rise here or there, over time, you don't see it immediate. You don't see it affecting you immediately. But what you do see is the increase in storms and drought, but the increase in storms causing flooding, and that is really going to affect developing countries. And again, I go back to the ability, a country can flip so quickly if it's on the margins, and the effects of climate change cause it to, flooding, loss of jobs, loss of power, loss of everything. But what I find interesting is that our Defense Department gets what I'm saying. And they may not call it climate change, they may call it just world change. But what they care about is if they're going to be able to do their operations around the world, or even here at, say, a place like Norfolk, if we have these increased storms and floods and severe weather, and they can't get their folks to work, they can't get economies around the world, work people around the world to be able to continue to work. It destabilizes the global situation. So my guess is they are going to play a role to try to keep us in the climate accord. And I think they're hearing that from their own other navies and militaries around the world, of the importance of us addressing climate change, because destabilization as an effect from climate change means migrants, it means lack of jobs, it means so many issues. So I think, again, in the end, I mean, maybe I'm just being hopeful, I think we're going to stay in the accord, and I think in the future, and particularly with Congress, I think they're going to get, and I think you're going to see appropriations for some of these climate issues that have been zeroed out.
Yeah,
that was a really long answer to that, but it's a complicated question.
Yeah, it is a complicated question. I think that, a new Secretary General took office at the UN at the beginning of this year. He is someone who has a big emphasis on reform and streamlining the UN, and he's also someone whose background is in refugees and displacement issues. And so it seems to me like it was pretty terrible timing to have a budget like this that reflects priorities like this come out. Because there was already a pretty significant effort underway, spearheaded by this new Secretary General, to really try to make the UN do more with less. So there was already a lot of reform initiatives underway, and when you throw this kind of budget into the mix, I mean, like I've said, this $1 billion figure has been out for a while now, the cuts to UN peacekeeping. That's not a constructive way to have a conversation about how to improve the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping. You don't start by, hanging a sword over the neck of UN peacekeeping and then try and figure out cuts. It's an arbitrary figure, the $1 billion. It doesn't encourage, a really constructive conversation. On the contrary, it encourages different departments and offices at the UN to be fighting with each other to prove their worth, right? Say, if you're going to cut them, don't cut me. And that's not a constructive conversation to be having. So I think that there is some amount of resentment that I'm seeing from other UN member states, including countries that are friends of the US, for sort of interrupting what could have been a very constructive reform process led by the UN Secretary General. And I think that it's going to be, there's going to be increased reason for resentment when you look at UN peacekeeping missions. So I just mentioned I came back from the Central African Republic, right, a few days ago. While I was there was an attack on UN peacekeepers, and 4 Cambodians and 1 Moroccan soldier were hacked to death with machetes. It was an awful incident. The US is not putting its troops in harm's way for UN peacekeeping missions. We're funding them, but we aren't risking our soldiers' lives. It seems like a pretty good deal for the US, all things considered, that we're getting a lot of our strategic aims around the world being met with a pretty small amount of funding and no risk to our troops' lives, when other countries are making, enormous sacrifices for the same cause. So for the US then to be seen as sort of arbitrarily threatening to slash funding to this initiative, I think other countries are going to have plenty of reason to resent this kind of approach.
Mm-hmm. Actually, as Sally answered my question before I asked it, I wanted to talk about climate destability and the military and how they are sort of very much a supporting role there. So I don't know if you have any more comments, but it's a critical issue, I think, and certainly entwined in what we're talking about.
Well, you could go on, but I mean, even looking at like some of the programs that fund climate research into sea ice in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly a strategic area for the United States with the ice melting, and yet they've cut the funds for us to be able to predict that. Very important for our military exercises.
Any other questions in the audience?
Could you speak to the Department of Energy's programs and nuclear aspects of it, both commercial and more broadly in terms of weapons?
I'm glad you asked because I was going to mention that I was just going back to Kate's comment on the joke about giving him more ammo. This is even true sort of within the larger Defense Department budget, including the budget that goes to the Department of Energy, which includes significantly more money for weapons programs and less money for non-proliferation. I thought it was particularly interesting. Someone pointed out yesterday that the State Department's fact sheet didn't even mention non-proliferation as a priority, which is pretty scary when we're thinking about really the very likely threat of nuclear weapons is probably more in the non-proliferation side. I think there are folks in the room certainly who deal more than I do with that with that part of the budget. But the deterrence aspect, which is the part that we're pumping all of this money into, and the Obama administration was already pumping historic levels of money into nuclear weapons, into rebuilding our entire nuclear weapons complex, because they're rebuilding every part of the triad all at the same time. So there's really a lot of money going there, and the Trump administration sort of looked at that investment and said, where is there not quite enough going, and bumped up that. There's a significant amount more for the LRSO, which was not receiving quite as much funding in 17 projections. So it's really, and the rhetoric also has been that they're going to be, really, really investing in nuclear weapons modernization, which is you can have whatever opinion you do about that, but at the same time, when you really look at the nuclear threat and you're not also investing in non-proliferation, there's a real problem.
Reminds me of some of his comments from the campaign where he was sort of encouraging proliferation, to be honest.
Exactly.
But
Absolutely.
that aside.
Everyone should have a nuclear weapon.
What do you expect? I feel like from the defense side, it's probably business as usual in terms of the congressional testimony that we'll hear. But when you have agency heads, and now Secretary Tillerson seems to have pretty much bought into what's coming out of state, but places like EP, well, no, you've got Pruitt. I guess I'm going to kill my question because it's really, I was going to say, when you have the agency going up on the Hill and then sort of defending their budget when actually there's no buy-in from the agency itself, like what is that going to look like? But when I think about it, the actual heads of the agency are Trump approved, so they probably will make the case. But thinking ahead sort of to the congressional season of budget testimony, what do you expect in terms of the questioning, but also the testimony?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of hostility. I mean, and I think that there'll be a lot of focus on economics. You know, the world is a really complicated place right now, and it's a really dangerous place right now. And I think that during these hearings, you will see that connection of this is not the time for us to be retrenching, and we need to have that balancing, as we've been saying all along, of the hard and the soft power. Because, and I think you are going to hear a lot of that coming out during these hearings.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Well, I would just say the one exception that I've seen so far seems to be Ambassador Nikki Haley, who seems to have gone her own way on Russia, on refugees, and on, I mean, she is new to UN peacekeeping as an issue, but from what I understand, she seems to see the value in UN peacekeeping missions, with some exceptions. So I think she is expected to testify. So I think that will be a hearing that I'll be keeping an eye on.
In addition to everything else, it does really seem like a missed opportunity in many ways, because in all of these, across the board, there's opportunity for reform and change, whether it's UN peacekeeping or, you know, I don't think there's as much fraud, waste, and abuse as it's often made out to be, but there's obviously room for change. And when you start the conversation like this, you're only going to be met with hostility versus people willing to kind of engage. And I think that is a missed opportunity. Anybody else for questions? Yeah.
Excuse me, just if you remove that last question a little bit. Sorry, I mean, I think it'd be hard to envision President Trump countenancing much dissent among his cabinet. But maybe you could talk a little bit about where you might see some flashpoints between particularly Republican appropriators and the administration's budget, areas where you might say, gosh, this budget is not going to work for Republicans on the Hill, because if that's where you're going to get change, that's where it's going to start from, right?
I mean, I think there are some Republicans who will push back on the defense increases. Fiscal conservatives certainly are going to be concerned about large defense increases, and I'll be really interested to see how the OCO issue plays this year, particularly because we saw such growing abuse in the 17 omnibus. I'll be interested to see how folks on the Hill react to that, and I'll be interested. Ultimately, the appropriators are the ones who decide what we're going to do with this budget, and their pen is sort of their word, and I'll be interested to see how they react. And what moves they make with regard to defense, you know, what actually does see a plus up and where things move around.
I was surprised to see, and I thought it was really telling that the Trump budget included another round of base closures in the U.S., that even the Trump administration...
Absolutely. I mean, particularly, it's going to be really interesting to see Republicans react to that, because the Obama administration has obviously been asking for a background for I think 5 years now, and you know, it's been sort of summarily declined by Congress. You know, folks don't want the effect of that in their districts, and I think that's, you know, Republicans and Democrats. But you know, having now bipartisan support from two different and very, very different administrations, asking for BRAC and the Pentagon wholeheartedly saying that they have, I think, 22%, they're 22% over capacity. That really it's time for Congress to react differently to this. Whether they do or not is going to be a big question.
Are there opportunities for congressional pushback?
Well, I mean, I think yesterday we had a pretty telling statement from Senator Graham, who came out and said, you know, the cuts to the State Department are a no-go because if they were enacted, we'd see, I think the quote was, a lot more Benghazis, right? So that's a pretty strong response right there. But then went on to say, you know, more broadly that this was a budget that reflected the U.S. stepping away from the world, you know, shrugging off its power, and that wasn't something that Congress wanted to support. Mm-hmm. So I think in general it was a pretty, you know, a pretty positive response. That Graham's statement, I think, will reflect the views of a lot of his Republican fellow congressmen that cuts to the State Department do in fact damage U.S. interests globally.
Mm. And on the domestic front, I mean, I can see a lot of pushback. I mean, whether it's, you know, climate research is being done by universities all over the country, and they reside in a lot of Republican districts, and you're already seeing, you know, the groundswell for that. The Sea Grant program, which was zeroed out, again, really impressive program that is in everybody's state and districts all around. Republicans already signed on saying they will oppose those cuts. Coastal zone management, you know, as I mentioned before. One of the ones I found really interesting was a DOI cut in what's called the Outer Continental Shelf revenue sharing program. And that's where oil and gas drilling revenues go back to the Gulf states where the drilling occurs to promote help for wetland reconstruction and you know, basically address the infrastructure that's being destroyed, the natural infrastructure that's being destroyed by the oil and gas pipelines and whatnot. And that's money that goes directly back to all these oil and gas Gulf states. Mostly Republican members of Congress in those states, and yet they zeroed out all that revenue sharing. So I think you've already heard a lot of the Gulf state Republicans saying, heck no, this is important for, you know, restoration of our natural resources, which also support our fisheries and, by the way, you know, our communities. Mm-hmm. So I think you're just going to see across the board a lot of interest in states and members that represent them coming out, regardless of party.
So it sounds like, too, don't just watch Congress, but governors and state government for a response.
I have one more question. Sorry.
So going back to Sally's talk about economics earlier, so as you can imagine, there's a lot of folks out there that are working on, you know, doing the economic values of the budget impacts, and actually Sally asked about the jobs number, but I think the biggest number that I am thinking about is the $6.6 trillion that's at risk in our coastal areas, and so, but what I'm hearing and I'm thinking is that you can make these economic arguments all you want, and they just aren't listening. And so I know this is a little off topic, but I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas or thoughts on how to get folks to listen when you're trying to, you know, present information that's generally scientific, which there's clearly a derision towards, in sort of support of the programs that are being cut.
Sorry, that's complicated.
It's really not that complicated. I mean, storytelling and examples from home of wherever the impacts are taking are the clearest way to be able to get members of Congress to listen when they're home in their district. I mean, it shouldn't be necessarily coming out of Washington. It needs to be home in their districts where they're being affected. And I think we've already started to see some of that all around the country, you know, on other issues. So.
The flip side is the international aspect, sort of how do you tell the story? There are, you know, a lot of these things don't have constituencies.
Right. I think, I mean, it's not, fortunately for me, I'm a researcher, not an advocacy person. I'm glad for that now more than ever. But I noticed that my colleague from the UN Foundation is here. I know that they're doing an event tonight looking at UN peacekeeping. It's co-hosted by the Mars Company, right? The Mars Candy Company.
Yes.
And the idea for that is that the UN peacekeeping mission in Cote d'Ivoire help to protect, I think it's some insane figure, like 80% or something, right, of all cocoa globally comes out of Cote d'Ivoire. And had the UN peacekeepers not been in place to keep that country stable, the Mars company would have been threatened and jobs back home would have been lost. And so I think that's the story that you're trying to tell tonight, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there are little ways, to show direct impact domestically, but I think that there are also stories you can tell. Obviously pictures out of Syria have had an impact on people emotionally in the U.S. If you go too far, it can create fatigue, but even apart from just a sort of very cold-blooded, it's in your economic interest domestically to support UN peacekeeping. I think that there are also sort of human stories that advocacy organizations can tell.
Or even Senator Graham kind of using the hot button word Benghazi.
Right.
I mean, the last thing that any administration wants is a scandal or a tragedy on their hands.
Yeah, and I mean, the more cynical answer would be, when it comes to UN peacekeeping, there is a big push to try and sort of reframe everything around counterterrorism. So even if UN peacekeepers aren't themselves doing counterterrorism, in Mali, they are keeping together a country that is seriously under threat from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So, I mean, I think that that's a little bit of a dangerous bandwagon to jump on, but certainly if you're looking to convince people, people in the U.S. do care about stopping terrorists, so that's a story you can tell as well.
All right, everybody, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the panel.